Mariana, there's so much news in America this week. In Washington, we've been covering the developments in Syria. We've been watching appointments to the Trump administration. But the only story we're really all talking about among ourselves, to be honest, whenever we gather around the kettle, is the suspected UnitedHealthcare shooter in New York, Luigi Mangione. First of all, the manhunt for him, and then everything we've discovered about him since he was arrested. It is gripping.
Yeah, and he's not just been the talk of Washington, D.C. from the sounds of it, Sarah. He's also been the talk of social media. I mean, you almost cannot move for the amount of posts and content about this man. Everything from people digging up his own kind of social media profiles, the kinds of stuff he's been reading and reviewing, but then also different people posting their takes and views about what's happened, abuse targeting people in McDonald's who spotted him, you name it. Everything is unfolding online. So it feels like it's a very appropriate topic for today's episode.
Welcome to Americast.
Americast from BBC News.
Hello, it's Sarah here. I have actually flown back to Scotland and I'm talking to you from Edinburgh.
It's Anthony. I'm still here in Washington, D.C. in the BBC Bureau.
And it is Mariana in the worldwide headquarters of Americast in London.
So we're going to go through this story that's got all of us so gripped and look at, well, firstly, what's actually been going on, what's true about what's happened, but mostly at the reaction to it, because it's been surprising, in some places actually shocking, what people have been saying about this shooting, but also what it reveals about America, American society, its healthcare, but also its attitudes to each other. So before we get to all of that, though, let's go through something of a timeline of exactly what it was that unfolded, first of all, in New York this week.
Yeah, so some people might be quite familiar now with the CCTV footage that showed that moment where Brian Thompson was shot close to the Hilton Hotel in New York. And people have pored over not just the footage that showed this moment where the suspect kind of pulled out a gun and shot him at pretty close range, but then the images that were subsequently released by the police showing the suspect with his mask pulled down. There were suggestions he'd been sort of flirting with someone in a hostel, and that's where that picture had come from. There are also images that seem to show him visiting a Starbucks at some point. And so, as is often the case now, when anything big happens, the internet sleuths kind of got to work trying to unpick and analyse what was going on here. And I think kind of initially there was that feeling, Sarah and Anthony, that this was a kind of, was it a serious operation? Was it a kind of trained assassin? What was going on here? Particularly because it took several days before there was any news at all about who this person might be.
I mean, the closed-circuit TV video was pretty cold-blooded. I mean, he walked up, took dead aim, shot him in the back, and then walked over afterwards and shot him several more times before calmly running away. He actually, his gun jammed at one point, and he unjammed it also. All of it looked very, very smooth. It's not the kind of thing you would expect from someone who had never killed a person before. And I think that may be why some of the people were speculating that this was a hired hit. Although to do it in a busy city, Midtown Manhattan, where all of these cameras are, it wasn't long before, as you mentioned, all of these different videos started surfacing. They knew he ran into Central Park to elude the immediate investigation. They found a backpack that they suspected was his in Central Park, full of Monopoly money. They knew that the suspect may have come to New York City on a bus that originated in Atlanta, and then it was only a matter of time before they put out I think it was a $50,000 reward and began expanding the net to try to track him down.
It was days, though, before he was found. And although he did do this just brazenly in the middle of the street in Midtown Manhattan, he then escaped. He disappeared into Central Park. The police couldn't find him. And all through the weekend, for instance, every time I went out to a Christmas party or whatever, firstly, it's all anyone was talking about, with this kind of slight sense that people were rooting for him. They didn't want to say it necessarily because you don't want to condone a murder like that. But there was a bit of a sense that, maybe the longer he could stay out there, it somehow made for a braver tale of daring do. Once we probably had excluded the idea that he was a professional hitman, the idea that he was just, an amateur who had planned this so well using a fake ID to check into the hostel and to travel to Manhattan in the first place. And as you say, Anthony, the way in which he cleared a blockage in the gun made it look as though this was somebody who wasn't unfamiliar with firearms. So it built up this astonishing, mysterious picture of somebody who didn't look like a rank amateur, but at the same time didn't appear to be a hired professional. And therefore, that's the point at which people were speculating about the motive and the fact that the victim was the chief executive officer of this huge healthcare insurance company, UnitedHealthcare, one of the biggest in America, and one that had been a bit controversial for refusing people's health claims. He'd been called up in front of Congress to talk about that sometime earlier. That just put together this story that everybody was fascinated by.
And like you kind of mentioned there, Sarah, there was this period of time where some people were kind of trying to unpick these clues and decipher them and decide what they meant. There were, all over TikTok, for example, I was seeing lots of these videos on the Undercover Voters social media feeds, but on my own feed as well. There were people who were kind of saying, well, let's sort of protect the assassin. We don't want him to be found because, we're also angry about the situation around health insurance in the United States. And so there was kind of that conversation ongoing. And it felt like it felt like a real moment when the news broke that a person of interest, Luigi Mangione, the kind of alleged suspected assassin here, had been found in McDonald's in Pennsylvania with all of the stuff, like with this ghost gun, with seemingly with some fake ID as well. And it kind of felt like, I guess it continued this arc that was almost like a film. And I think that's why people online particularly have been poring over this, because you almost couldn't make it up, the kind of story here.
And he was found with this ghost gun. And what a ghost gun is essentially is a gun that has been manufactured independently, apart from a gun manufacturer that has to register and put down a serial number on it, and therefore can't be traced in the way that a traditionally created and sold gun would. You have to register the gun, you can trace it to the manufacturer, you can trace it to the person who sold it. A ghost gun is one that doesn't have those markings. And there's actually a growing number of companies that produce and sell ghost gun kits. So they sell the parts of a gun that aren't completely easy to assemble. You might have to drill a little bit. You might have to do a few things to put it together, but it's a loophole around these federal gun laws that allows them to not have to put a serial number on it. So actually they found shell casings around the scene of the crime, and on those shell casings were written the words deny, defend, and depose. Those are tactics that big insurance companies use to avoid paying out claims or delay paying out claims to people who are seeking compensation for healthcare expenses. It's one of the big criticisms of the American healthcare industry, that in order to maximize their profits, they tend to try to deny claims and question the legitimacy of claims and take these claims to court where they can battle them out in order to increase their profits. And that clearly was something that was on the mind of the alleged assailant who wrote those on the bullet casings, wanted this to be found.
Even the way that Mangione was found was like something out of a movie. He'd traveled several hours away from Manhattan. He was in Altoona, Pennsylvania, sitting in a McDonald's having something to eat when some of the other customers in there were saying to themselves, he looks just like the guy in the photographs, and ended up calling the police. And in fact, one of those eyewitnesses ended up speaking to the BBC about that moment.
A guy came in the door, and I didn't really look at him. I thought everyone was kidding around. The one guy said, that looks like the shooter from New York. Well, then we laughed, and I guess he placed his order, and we just went on about our business. But we were kidding about it. We're like, well, boy, wouldn't that be something, you know?
And as you can imagine, the internet responded pretty wildly to all of this as well. Everything around the kind of McDonald's scenario. And not only have there been conspiracy theories of people saying, hang on a second, how was this guy able to, escape New York, and no one even was talking about what his name was, and then he kind of just got found in McDonald's with all the evidence. What does this mean? Has he been set up? All this kinds of stuff, often unevidenced claims and theories. And ranging from that to people then also trying to identify who the McDonald's worker was, or the person in McDonald's who had kind of tipped off the police, and people leaving reviews on that particular McDonald's, and also sending abuse, hate threats to the person they believe was responsible for reporting him, because they are supportive in some ways of what he's been doing. So it's been a sort of real social media frenzy in that way, which we often see happen with these kinds of stories, I guess not least because this one kind of is so cinematic, for want of a better word, or it's one that's really kind of gripped people's attention. But at its heart, as we've been talking about, you know, someone has been killed in broad daylight in New York, which is a pretty big deal, and someone who's kind of pretty important and influential as well.
Yeah, Americans love true crime stories. I mean, that's the reality, right? We've talked about this before with other cases where someone's killed. There's a manhunt, there's a search. These amateur sleuths like to get in and try to piece together all the clues. And then, of course, the healthcare, the health insurance component of this. This is something that touches every American's lives. We all have to deal with big health insurance companies in one time or another, in one way or another. Many of us are often frustrated by it. So add those two components, you could see why this is such a compelling story for people to follow. And we did hear from Mangione, actually, now as they were bringing him into the courtroom. He shouted, and what he said was picked up by the cameras who were there.
Yeah, it's not abundantly clear what is an insult to the intelligence of the American people that he's shouting about there. But of course, that's sort of somehow added to this anti-hero gloss that he's got.
Yeah, and a bit like whenever now there is any kind of shooting or attack, people will very, very quickly kind of pour over the social media profiles of the people involved and try and get some clues, even more clues in this situation as to what's happened and what motivated them and why it unfolded, or what's suspected of driving what happened. And so very, very quickly after the arrest happened, people went and found Luigi Mangione's account on X. The background image on that, for example, believed to show him, and then also an X-ray of his spine, and the suggestion that he perhaps was suffering from back pain or some kind of back injury. That's something that his friends have also confirmed to US media. They've said, he had some surgery, and suggested that he'd had difficulty with his back. And then if you look at his Reddit account, you can find other clues where, again, he does seem to be talking about kind of chronic back pain, brain fog, other issues relating to that. People have been looking at some of the books that he was reading as well, some relating again to the issue of back pain. So it really sort of has been fuel for the amateur sleuths, as you describe them, Anthony, to be able to kind of pour over and feel like they're solving the mystery because they've got lots of this kind of digital footprint in front of them.
He lived very much online, so it wasn't really hard to find all these breadcrumbs, to find things that he had posted, things he had said online. He had a computer engineering background as well, so he also was very adroit technologically. Another thing to notice that he has come from an upbringing of privilege, a wealthy family in Baltimore, Maryland, which is about 45 minutes, an hour north of Washington, D.C. here. He went to Ivy League schools, University of Pennsylvania. He is members of fraternities there, generally considered to be an intelligent guy. His family owned a country club. His family owned a radio station in Baltimore. They did have the resources to provide him with the kind of care he needed.
Yeah, and what we do know about Luigi Mangione, at least right now, is that he is planning to fight extradition from Pennsylvania to New York. His lawyers have said it's his constitutional right. And I've had loads of messages about this story, and Americasters have been getting in touch too. And we've had this question from JD via WhatsApp, who asks, news outlets are reporting that the suspect in custody in Pennsylvania is fighting extradition to New York. Can you explain this? In what circumstances could he be extradited? Or could they charge and try him in Pennsylvania for crimes committed in New York? Are the sentences likely to be different?
You got to remember, each state has its own criminal code, its own court system, its own jurisdiction. And so what you see on these sorts of things is typically one state will send it to the state where the crime is committed, and that's where it will be tried. While Mangione's lawyers may object to this. This isn't like extraditing someone from Brazil. This is a neighboring state. It's only a matter of time before he gets sent back to New York and tried there. Apparently, he's been charged with second-degree murder at this point. Second-degree murder, actually, there are different degrees of murder. Second degree means it wasn't a premeditated act. Typically, it's something that was done during a commission or the act of another crime, like if you rob a bank and you shoot someone, that's second-degree murder. First degree is where you plan it out. I wouldn't be surprised to see that charge ultimately changed to first-degree murder because, at least based on what we're hearing about the alleged crime and the preparations behind it, just from what we've seen and the evidence presented, that seems premeditated. But again, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not the prosecutors in New York. So we'll have to wait and see how this all plays out. But I think you would see him end up in a New York courtroom before too long.
Beyond the fascination with Luigi Mangione himself and the true crime aspects of this story, what this has also done is spark a whole new conversation in America about the healthcare system. There's a lot of controversy about how many people have been commenting on social media in support of what he is alleged to have done. And it's not just, comments on X or something. There have been op-ed pieces written, various different columnists saying that this is, if not justified, at least very least unsurprising that somebody would finally take action against one of the healthcare companies. And even though we don't know what happened to Luigi Mangione himself, we are hearing more and more stories as a result about people who have really suffered as a result of claims being denied or delayed. Not just with UnitedHealthcare, with all the big insurers, but it feels as though it's starting a conversation about what's wrong with healthcare in America, but one that may not go any further than every conversation that always starts about trying to institute some kind of gun control in America. Anthony, presumably this happens cyclically. Every so often people say the healthcare system doesn't work and then nothing happens.
Yeah, I mean, things did happen, about 14 years ago with the Obama administration. There was a pretty massive government attempt to regulate private health insurance, because you have to remember the American health system is mostly privately run for-profit health insurance, or at least people who are working in America. You don't get government run health insurance until you get Medicare, which is the elderly health insurance program. I think you have to be 65 to qualify for that. Or if you're very poor, and then there's a government-run health insurance, Medicaid, that covers people who are poor. But most people get their health insurance in the United States through their employers, through these for-profit companies. And so you end up working with for-profit companies. And so there are periodically attempts to reform the system, and there have been some successful attempts to reform the system. But clearly, even what was done in the Obama administration wasn't enough to make people happy with the way the health system in this country runs. So all the money that is spent on health insurance in this country, and despite that fact, the American people have been getting sicker, less healthy over the past 10 years than instead of getting healthier.
Whenever I interface with the American healthcare system, it absolutely blows my mind, some aspects of it. So firstly, you get much more care. I'm forever being sent off for scans and x-rays and all sorts of diagnostic treatments that you really wouldn't get quite so easily or quite so quickly on the NHS. But then every so often, the insurance company does mess up a bit, and I'll get sent a bill for something that they're meant to have covered. Now, usually it's not that difficult to sort out, and unfortunately, touch wood, up until this point, I haven't been really sick whilst I've been in the United States. But they'll send me a bill for, maybe just taking routine blood tests for your annual checkup. And it'll be over $1,000 that they want paid for that. And of course, if a few phone calls and a couple of letters later, you get it sorted out and I don't have to pay that out of my own pocket. It comes out of the insurance. But every time I see one of these things, my jaw is on the table thinking, how can you charge $1,000 for some routine blood test? No wonder this industry is so huge and so hated.
Yeah, I run into that all the time. I think every American has stories, whether it's my son going to an emergency room and it not immediately being covered because he went to an emergency room in a different state, and there's questions about the insurance company covering that. When my child was younger, we used to have to get reauthorized to see a back doctor, an orthopedist, a pediatric orthopedist within our city because the insurance company wanted us to drive 2.5 hours to an in-network provider in Houston, which is a separate city from Austin, because that was who they thought was the closest person. And every year we had to fight. Every year on the day, the first of the year, have to fight to get that insurance company to cover the local doctor that was 15 minutes away instead of the one that was 2.5 hours away. And these are stories that are not unique to me. And certainly, I think a lot of Americans understand that just grappling with these vast bureaucracies that have a predisposition in part to not paying out because that's how they make money. They don't want to spend all of this money. They want to verify that the money is being spent in the right place in their views. But this profit motive does, I think in the view of many Americans, it does corrupt the system. It does make the system more inclined to side with the insurance company rather than the patient.
And actually, what you're both describing there is essentially what a lot of people on social media have been talking about. This very sort of gripping narrative and story, even though obviously at the heart of it is, someone being killed, and is a really kind of tragic story. It's really, really sparked a conversation in this way, with people then talking about their own experiences and in some ways to the shock of quite a few people, and perhaps not to the shock of quite a few other people, celebrating really what's happened. There's even people selling like T-shirts, merchandise, stuff like that online with those words: deny, defend, depose, in support of Luigi Mangione, or in support of what he's suspected of doing and playing a part in. And I think that just tells you about, we've seen that kind of glorification happen all the time around murder or crimes that have been committed. But this story in particular, and I guess what's going to unfold in terms of the case and what happens, is one that's going to continue to grip Americans, both online and in the real world, in the conversations that they're having.
Yeah, and that's why you've got people like Democratic politicians who might be sympathetic to the conversation we've just been having about some of the problems that there are with the major health insurers, coming out to stamp very hard on the idea that this guy is any kind of hero or that his actions should be defended. He was arrested in Pennsylvania, and the governor there, Josh Shapiro, condemned that reaction at the briefing that announced the arrest.
Okay, so that's Shapiro's take, but there are others like Elizabeth Warren, a progressive senator from Massachusetts, who on one hand condemned the violence, but also said she understood it.
And as is so often the case when there are these kinds of frenzies on social media, aside from people who feel really let down and have had terrible experiences in terms of their health insurance, again, beyond any specific company, but in general, there's also obviously a person who's been killed here, Brian Thompson. We know that he joined UnitedHealth Group in 2004, and he's worked his way right up to the top. He'd previously served as the CEO of the company's government programs, including Medicare and retiree coverage. And I guess because there's been so much focus on Luigi Mangione and people unpicking and trying to piece together what's happened and who he is, there's perhaps been a bit less of a conversation about Brian Thompson himself. But his wife did speak to CBS News, Paulette Thompson, and she said that Brian was an incredibly loving, generous, talented man who truly lived life to the fullest and touched so many lives. Most importantly, Brian was an incredibly loving father to our 2 sons and will be greatly missed.
And that's what must not get lost in all of this. This was a husband and father who, was gunned down in the street in cold blood. And that, to a certain extent, with some of the excitement around the alleged shooter, has fallen off the agenda a little bit. And in fact, it's worried other CEOs so much that some of them have been paying for security, changing their daily routines, taking their photographs off their company websites, worried that this is not even necessarily just about healthcare, that there's some kind of anti-corporate, anti-capitalist feeling underlying in America that could put any of them at danger.
And that shouldn't come as a huge shock. Like this anti-establishment trend in American society has been very obvious, and we've talked about it in the past. People feel like the system, and not just the healthcare system, but the system, whether it's governments, corporations, institutions, aren't working for them anymore, and that has reaching a boiling point. And I think there's the concern, the very valid concern, that that boiling point might include violence.
And that's quite a uniquely American response to this sort of thing. Fury at capitalism, at the establishment, at the system that isn't working for everybody. That's a fairly universal experience at the moment, and we see that playing out in different elections in different countries. But the idea that to assuage that frustration, you reach for a weapon isn't something you see in that many other places. Always makes me feel that America is such a young society in so many ways, and just not that far removed from the pioneer spirit that set it up, which did involve a lot of violence at the time. Because you can imagine in Europe, people taking what they would think would be drastic actions to, handcuff themselves to the front of the UnitedHealthcare building and go on a hunger strike, or, cover the executives in red paint, or take on various other kinds of protests, maybe stop all the traffic in central Manhattan to draw attention to their cause, but not to reach for a weapon and murder somebody. That doesn't happen in that many countries.
I also think there's this element of social media, I guess, from my point of view and the stuff I look at, which is that, people have always been they've often rallied around particular causes, perhaps would have gone out and protested or felt very strongly about a particular incident or a particular issue. But there's something about the ability of social media to amplify individual stories like this, which are very, very gripping, which the algorithms, the recommendation systems will kind of further push into people's feeds because they are gripping and they make you kind of sit up and take notice. And the ability to kind of create an online movement that can kind of dehumanize, I guess, the people involved and makes it feel a bit like a true crime film. This feels like the kind of perfect storm online in terms of a story that has ignited a conversation about something that people care about, but that ultimately, at its heart, is about violence, and could have pretty far-reaching consequences in terms of what it means for the people who both support what's happened and who don't support it.
There's a long line in American history going back to Bonnie and Clyde and Billy the Kid of anti-heroes, of people taking the law into their own hands, or fighting the system and being celebrated for it, becoming cult heroes because of it. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised. I think you're right, Sarah. I think there is something ingrained in the American character that this kind of this Western outdoors violent vigilante kind of spirit that comes from the fact that a lot of American society was rough for a while. This was a country that was settled by people and settled in places where there was no established law. So that may contribute to a bit of our celebration of this instance as well.
And also individualism in America, that instead of thinking somebody should do something about this, Americans think I should do something about this, which in some circumstances can be fantastic. It's just in some circumstances it can end in violence and tragedy, sadly. But it's a strain of the American spirit, which in many ways can be laudable. But it's also worth mentioning, I think, the other thing that makes this kind of uniquely American is if this had happened in the UK, we would not be able to have this conversation. We would know Luigi Mangione's name. We would be able to say that he had been arrested and that he'd been charged with second-degree murder, and that would be about it. All this trailing through his social media history, interviews with people who knew him or family members, none of that would have been able to be broadcast or put in the newspapers because there would be reporting restrictions clamped right down on that. But the freedom of speech in America means that you can tell these stories even while the wheels of justice are turning.
So I guess from here, we're going to expect Mangione to be sent to New York. He's going to be brought to a courtroom. The charges are going to be presented against him. We might hear more from his lawyers. I think a lot of our listeners are now familiar with the American judicial system. At some point, this will reach a trial, which I'm sure Sarah and Mariana will be a circus, like many of the high-profile trials in this country, unless something happens in the intervening months. But this is just the beginning of what should be a long legal process where we have a chance to see more of this story and get more details and maybe even hear more from Mangione himself.
Now, while you're all getting ready for Christmas, or the holidays, as they're known in America, you might have started to mull over New Year resolutions. We've got something different on our mind here. We're starting to think up what predictions we're going to put in the 2025 time capsule. This year, we want you to tell us what we should be making suggestions and predictions about. So write in or get in touch with us and tell us what you want us to be gazing into our crystal balls and coming up with. And I guess you can probably come up with the most difficult questions that will humiliate us the most when we open the 2025 time capsule this time next year.
And as ever, it's all the usual ways of getting in touch. You can send us a WhatsApp on +44 330 123 9480. You can email americast@bbc.co.uk, and you can join our Discord server. The link is in the description.
See you all later. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.
Americast.
Americast from BBC News.